You are crouched in tall grass on the edge of a floodplain 60,000 years ago. Your muscles are tight. 20 meters away, an antelope lifts its head, testing the wind. You have a sharpened stick in your hand. That's it. That's your entire arsenal. To kill this animal, you need to get close enough to touch it with a spear, close enough that it can smell your fear before you smell its blood. Most of the time, it runs. Most of the time, you go home hungry. Somewhere in the next few thousand years, a handful of humans are going to solve this problem in a way that changes everything. They're going to figure out how to kill from a distance, with a weapon so simple it looks like a toy, and so effective it will still be in use when humans land on the moon. So how did a piece of bent wood and a taut string become the deadliest invention of the ancient world? Let's start with the problem itself, because it's bigger than it sounds. A spear is limited by the strength of a human arm. Even a skilled thrower can rarely hit a moving target beyond 15 meters, roughly the length of a bowling lane. Anything past that, and you're just hoping. Prey animals know this. They evolved flight distances specifically to stay outside that range. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans were stuck in this standoff, technologically outmatched by a gazelle's sense of self-preservation. Most people assumed the bow was invented once, by one clever person, in one place. It wasn't. The bow appears to have been invented independently, multiple times, on multiple continents, by people who had no contact with each other whatsoever, no shared language, no trade routes, no way to compare notes. That's not a coincidence. That's convergent evolution, the same problem producing the same solution over and over, because physics doesn't care what continent you're on. So when did this actually happen? For decades, archaeologists pointed to European cave art from around 15,000 years ago as the earliest solid evidence. Stick figures at sites like the Spanish cave of Cueva de los Casares, drawn holding curved objects with lines that looked suspiciously like arrows. That was the textbook answer. Then, in 2010, everything got pushed back by tens of thousands of years. At Sibudu Cave in South Africa, archaeologist Lynn Wadley and her team uncovered stone points so small and so precisely shaped that they couldn't have been spear tips. They were too light. Too delicate. Some weighed less than 2 grams, about the weight of a paperclip. A spear tip that light would shatter on impact. But an arrowhead that light makes perfect sense, because an arrow doesn't rely on mass. It relies on speed. Wadley's team dated these points to roughly 64,000 years ago. 64,000. That's not a typo, and it rewrote the timeline entirely. But how do you prove a rock is an arrowhead and not just a small spear point? This is where the science gets genuinely clever. Researchers examined the points under microscopes, hunting for microfractures, tiny impact scars that formed differently depending on how fast an object was traveling when it hit something. A spear thrust leaves one kind of fracture. A projectile launched at speed leaves a completely different one. The Sibudu points showed the high-velocity signature. Something had launched them. Fast. And here's a detail that rarely makes it into the textbooks. We also have chemical evidence of poison use from roughly the same era and region. At Sibudu, researchers found a wooden applicator stick coated in a residue containing ricinoleic acid, a compound found in castor beans, and a known poison. Poison and archery, it turns out, are technological partners. A poisoned arrow doesn't need to hit a vital organ. It just needs to break the skin. That changes the entire calculus of hunting. Suddenly, you don't need to be a perfect shot. You need to be a good enough shot, and the toxin finishes the job. So the bow didn't just solve the distance problem. It solved the accuracy problem too, by making accuracy less necessary. That's the kind of layered, compounding innovation that defines a true technological leap, not one breakthrough, but several stacking on top of each other. Now, why did this happen in Africa, and why then? We don't know with certainty, but the leading theory is written into the rock layers themselves. Around 70,000 years ago, southern Africa swung through violent climate whiplash, years of drought collapsing into sudden floods, grasslands turning to desert and back again within a single lifetime. Imagine growing up hunting one way, only to watch the animals your family has always tracked simply vanish from the landscape. Old techniques stopped working. Old maps stopped meaning anything. And when survival stops rewarding the old way of doing things, people experiment, because the alternative is starving. Groups that stumbled onto projectile weapons had a massive edge, and that edge got passed down, generation after generation, refined each time. From there, the story goes global. Around 12,000 years ago, in what's now Germany, hunters at a site called Stelmoor were using bows built for reindeer hunting in the tundra, and archaeologists recovered actual wooden bow fragments preserved in peat bogs, a rare case where the organic material itself survived instead of just the stone tips. In North America, indigenous peoples independently developed bow technology by at least 2,500 years ago, with distinct regional designs. The sinew-backed bows of the plains, built to survive extreme temperature swings, versus the self-bows of eastern woodland peoples, carved from single pieces of hickory or Osage orange. In Asia, by around 1200 BCE, Chinese and Central Asian cultures were already producing composite bows, a completely different engineering approach that we're about to get into. Because here's the real turning point. What changed the bow from a hunting tool into a weapon of empires wasn't a new idea. It was better engineering. And it's one of the most underrated achievements of the ancient world. A simple wooden bow, what's often called a self-bow, is limited by the wood itself. Push a piece of wood too far, and it either breaks or loses its spring, a problem archers call taking a set. There's a ceiling on how much power you can squeeze out of a single stave of yew or ash. Composite bows shattered that ceiling. Craftsmen in Central Asia and the Middle East began laminating multiple materials together: wood for the core, animal horn glued to the belly of the bow to resist compression, and sinew stretched across the back to resist tension. 3 materials, 3 different jobs, working together like a spring made of spare parts. The result was devastating. A well-made composite bow, like those used by Mongol horse archers under Genghis Khan in the 13th century, could reach draw weights of over 150 pounds, launching arrows with enough force to punch through armor at ranges beyond 300 meters, roughly the length of 3 football fields laid end to end. And here's the part that made it a war-winning technology: these bows were short enough to fire from horseback, at a full gallop, in any direction, including backward over the shoulder, the maneuver later romanticized as the Parthian shot, named after the Parthian Empire's cavalry, who used it against Roman legions centuries earlier. But raw power wasn't actually the deciding factor in battle. That's the part people usually miss. It was rate of fire combined with mobility. A trained horse archer could loose 10 to 12 arrows per minute while maneuvering, effectively turning a small cavalry unit into a mobile artillery battery that could strike and retreat before enemy infantry ever closed the distance. Entire empires were built on this asymmetry. The Mongols conquered a landmass covering nearly a quarter of the Earth's inhabited surface, and the composite bow was the engine underneath that expansion. Meanwhile, in medieval England and Wales, a different kind of bow was creating its own legend: the longbow. Unlike the composite bow's layered engineering, the longbow was almost aggressively simple: a single stave of yew, often the height of the archer holding it, roughly 6 feet long. What it lacked in cleverness, it made up for in brute force and mass production. At the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, English longbowmen, thousands of them, drawn largely from the working class, unleashed volleys against French knights on horseback. Draw weights on recovered longbows from the Mary Rose shipwreck, raised from the seabed in 1982, have been estimated at up to 180 pounds, requiring years of childhood training to even physically draw. Skeletal remains of longbowmen from that era still show it today: visible deformation in the shoulders and spine, permanent physical changes carved into bone by a lifetime of drawing that much force, over and over. So if the bow was this dominant, why did it eventually disappear from warfare? Not in a single battle. Not in a single decade. It lost the way most dominant technologies lose, slowly, and to something worse. Because for centuries, gunpowder weapons were genuinely, measurably worse than bows. Early firearms were slower to reload, less accurate, and prone to misfiring the moment it rained. A skilled longbowman could outshoot an early musketeer several times over in both speed and precision. But none of that mattered, because a musket could be mastered in weeks, and a longbow took a lifetime, starting in childhood, building the specific bone and muscle structure needed to draw hundreds of pounds of force accurately. Armies stopped needing their best archers. They needed soldiers who were merely adequate, and they needed a lot of them, fast. By the late 1500s, firearms had overtaken bows on most European battlefields, not because they were better, but because they were replaceable. Skill lost to scale, and yet the bow never actually vanished. It just changed jobs. It became a tool of ceremony in Japanese Kyudo, where form and breadth matter as much as accuracy. It became recreation, then Olympic sport, with modern competitive archers using compound bows, a 1960s American invention using pulley systems that can hold a full draw weight with a fraction of the physical effort, letting archers aim with a precision no medieval bowman ever had. It became, quietly, one of the only Stone Age technologies still actively used, competitively, by millions of people today. Somewhere in a museum case, maybe in Cape Town, near where those 64,000-year-old points from Sibudu Cave are kept, or maybe in a small display in England holding a longbow salvaged from the Mary Rose, sits a curved piece of wood and a length of cord. It looks unremarkable. A child could hold it and not understand what they were touching. But that object, in one form or another, outlasted empires. It armed hunters before agriculture existed, before writing existed, before most of what we call civilization existed. It is, quite possibly, the single most successful piece of technology humans have ever built, not because it was complicated, but because it solved one problem so completely that we never really stopped using the answer.